Hey everybody, it's your favorite dirty birdie back with another bitchly video wherein I share my cockadoodie opinions about Stephen King's 1987 masterpiece, Misery. I'll show you what to look for when trying to identify a first US and first UK edition of the book. I'll also take a look at the special edition from Folio Society and the big bastard of a special edition from Suntup Editions. The first US edition of Misery was published by Viking. There's the author photo on the back of the jacket. Inside the jacket, look for a printed price of $18.95. And on the copyright page, look for the language first published in 1987 by Viking Penguin Incorporated. No number line. Underneath the jacket, you have gray boards, Stephen King's initials imprinted in red foil. Looks pretty sharp. Black cloth over the spine and more red printing. Pretty good looking book. That is the first US edition. The first UK edition was published by Hodder and Stoughton. There's the front cover, spine, same back cover author photo as the US edition. Inside the front flap of the jacket, look for a price of £11.95. And on the copyright page, look for the language first printed 1987. No indication of any other printing on the first print. Just says first printed 1987. Underneath the jacket, there's single color boards and spine all the way around. In this case, it's blue, and the lettering on the spine is printed in silver. Looks pretty sharp. I know I'm sort of a broken record in these videos about paper quality, but once again, the UK edition demonstrates inferior paper quality. These books are the same age. The US edition is, not as fresh as it was in 1987, and who is as fresh as they were in 1987, but it noticeably fares better than the UK edition. It's just another example of this unfortunate feature of UK editions from this era. But anyway, there's the UK first edition. When I first started collecting UK editions, I initially started with the books where the UK cover art looked a lot different than the US. Something that really stood out as being distinct and unique. And Misery is a great example of cover art that is appropriate, it makes sense to the story, but it's very different and very unique from the US edition. I can't say which one I like better. I think they're both relatively understated, they're both creepy, they're both effective. The US edition definitely plays up the stranded, handicapped in a wheelchair, being held prisoner by this spooky, shadowy figure brandishing an axe. Doesn't really indicate that the character in the wheelchair is a writer. And the UK edition focuses pretty much exclusively on the writing aspect. So between the two of these, I think there's a really awesome and perfect dust jacket art. The US one I'm much more familiar with. I remember my grandma having this book in her collection when I was a kid and looking it over. I'm very familiar with this. So my eye goes more to the UK edition. just because of the novelty factor. I imagine if I had grown up in the UK, the US edition would seem really interesting and unique and novel. I know, no pun intended. I mean, maybe there was a pun intended, so apologies for that. But anyway, the two side by side make an interesting companions to each other, and look really nice side by side on the shelf. I won't delve into too much detail on the special editions because I made an entire different video comparing the Folio Society and the Suntup editions of Misery. But here is the 2021 artist edition of Misery from the Folio Society. Comes with a plain paper slipcase, very utilitarian, but it gets the job done. Anyway, no dust jacket. It was printed, released in this artist edition or gift edition, as well as a signed limited edition, which was much more expensive, immediately sold out, and is now, of course, quite valuable. I am unsure. I know Folio does multiple printings of some of their titles. So this is a first printing, and I'm unsure now if the first printing is still what's available from Folio. But if you just want the book and you don't really care so much about the printing, I believe Misery is still available from the Folio Society. It's a good-looking book, well worth checking out. There's the end papers. The book is illustrated, sort of a unique, washed out kind of art style, which is pretty cool and pretty effective. So yeah, anyway, there's the Folio Society edition from 2021. The Suntup Editions release of Misery is from 2018 and was their debut inaugural book release, and I talk about in the comparison video between these two editions. Suntup pulled out all the stops on this release to make as big a splash as possible. It was released in, I think, 1,250 artist editions, artist edition copies, 250 numbered and 26 lettered. And the numbered is one of the more valuable Stephen King signed editions. The lettered, even more so. This is a fairly recent special edition, but has already attained mythical status in the Stephen King collecting world. So there's the lovely slipcase for the artist edition. The dust jacket. Underneath the dust jacket is this nice effect. Looks like typewriter keys inlaid into the cover. Very, very luxe and soft feeling covering on the boards. It is signed by artists Rick Berry and Dave Christensen. Very nice touch. It's a very high quality piece of work. The art is printed full color directly into the page block. This is an oversized trim, 7 by 10 instead of the standard 6-inch by 9-inch, and it really allows the text some breathing room. It's easy to read, easy to handle. Just a very, very classy and lovely book. So anyway, there's another video on my channel comparing these two in more detail, but these represent the only UK limited edition of Misery and US limited edition of Misery to date. It took, what would that be, 87 to 2018, so over 30 years for Stephen King to license Misery to anyone for a special edition. And since 2018, it is also had a second special edition release. They're both unique, they're both interesting, and they're both worth seeking out if you are interested. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that there was also an unauthorized bootleg German language edition of Misery from back in the 80s, and that is entitled Sie, which I believe translates as you and not as misery. But anyway, a very, very rare item. It was not officially authorized by Stephen King, so it did take until 2018 for him to sign off on an official authorized limited edition. But C, the German bootleg edition, is a really interesting and unique piece in the Stephen King universe. So I did want to put that out there. I've never seen one in person, but there are pictures out there, and it is a really interesting item. I also want to divert for a minute to talk about one of my favorite pieces of Stephen King artwork. This is the first paperback edition of Misery from Signet. And so if you've read the novel, and I don't think this is a spoiler in a major way, not giving away too much, but the main character, Paul Sheldon, is an author, and he has literary aspirations, but has made his fame and fortune, not unlike Stephen King, writing very popular fiction, in this case a series of historical romance novels about a character named Misery Chastain. And underneath the main front cover, there's a false front cover, which is artwork for one of Paul Sheldon's novels, Misery's Return. It's the novel that's featured, the story that's featured as being written within the story of Misery. And of course, as Paul Sheldon, or as the main character, Stephen King. This amuses the heck out of me. I love this artwork so much. I wish that it were released in a poster or a larger art print. I would buy one in a heartbeat, frame it, and hang it up on the wall. That is, if sort of a cross between Stephen King and Fabio. And anyway, it only, as far as I know, it only exists in the paperback edition. So it's even if you don't collect paperbacks, that's a mark in favor of picking up this item, because that piece of artwork is pretty classic and cracks me up. As I understand it, Misery actually started life as a Richard Bachman novel, and if Stephen King hadn't been found out after the publication of Thinner, I understand Misery would have come out under the Richard Bachman name. And in the dark half, the 1989 novel, Stephen King delves a lot more deeply into this dual nature relationship of an author and their pseudonym alter ego. And in interviews, he's talked about how Donald Westlake was an inspiration, and Donald Westlake wrote under a pseudonym, Richard Stark, a series of gritty, kind of racy, hard-boiled crime thrillers. So Donald Westlake, he described himself, the Donald Westlake novels are the sunny day novels, and the Richard Stark novels are the rainy day novels. And Stephen King, I think, was fascinated by that idea. And Stephen King was the sunny day novelist, and Richard Bachman was sort of an alter ego, a bit of a more rainy day alter ego, where things were darker, bleaker, more pessimistic. And it's just interesting to note that Misery was on its way to being a Richard Bachman novel, and it came out under the Stephen King name, and is memorably dark, fairly bleak. Stephen King is, in my opinion, generally known for, if not straight up happy endings, at least endings that are more positive and that open a window to hope for the characters going forward. And Misery is just, I don't know, a little bit meaner, a little bit bleaker. It's very telling that the dedication is to Stephanie and Jim Leonard. Stephanie, I believe, I may be wrong. I think Stephanie was his sister-in-law, and was his personal assistant for some time. And the novel infamously features Annie Wilkes, who is the author Paul Sheldon's #1 fan. And the dedication says, "This is for Stephanie and Jim Leonard, who know why. Boy, do they," in reference to all of the strange and bizarre mail and correspondence that they had intercepted and fielded on Stephen King's behalf from his self-professed #1 fans. And Misery is fascinating because it, in some ways, seems autobiographical, like it opens a window into Stephen King's own feelings and perceptions about his fame and about his fans. And it's not really a flattering look at how he perceives his fans. It's not fair to say that he would perceive all of his fans that way, but I'm sure he's seen enough weirdness and obsessive behavior to have developed a healthy skepticism about his fame and his fan base. And I'm here doing these videos because I am a somewhat obsessive Stephen King fan. I would like to think that if I was driving in the mountains in a snowstorm and I pulled him out of a wrecked car on the side of the road, I would promptly take him to the hospital and get him help, and not kidnap him and hold him hostage in my country farmhouse. But then again, I've never been put in that situation. And I know there are a lot of people who consider themselves his #1 fan, but anyway, I'm not going to continue down that path because anyway, Misery, coming on the heels of the behemoth Leviathan of It, is just over 300 pages in hardcover. It's basically two people in one setting, which I think is a really interesting stylistic challenge after the sprawl of It. This seems like Stephen King challenging himself to work on a much smaller scale, and I find the writing aspect, the novel within the novel element, to be fascinating. I was afraid before I read the novel that I would find that to be distracting and unnecessary padding to the page count, but it really is vital to the story. And in a book with two main characters and some pretty memorable set pieces, it's easy to remember a lot of what happens. The bigger Stephen King books, there's so many characters, there's so much action, there's so much plot. You can remember parts, bits and pieces, some of the bigger scenes and set pieces, but a lot of the overall detail gets lost in the wash of the sheer size of the novel. But in Misery, it's been a few years since I've read this, but it really lingers in the memory. I remember how it felt to read it. I remember, the sense of claustrophobia, the sense of terror, the sense of triumph as Paul slowly but surely finds his way toward at least some kind of mobility and gets a better handle on his situation. It is a really unique piece of work, and as always happens with Stephen King, it's really, I think it's hard to consider the fate, the quality of the novel independently of the famous movie that was released based on the novel. Stephen King's career, I think he stands alone now, but certainly when he was getting his start, his fortune was tied to the popularity of the movies that were made from his works. And I think, in retrospect, the books that had famous, well-made, heart-wrenching movies made of them tend to stand out more, for better or for worse. Shawshank Redemption, The Green Mile, Misery, Carrie, The Shining, which is, I know, arguable, debatable, and a subject for a whole other video. But when I watched the movie years and years and years ago, and it was hard when I was reading the novel not to think about Kathy Bates and James Caan in the roles. And I found that while I was familiar with the story, the novel still wove a magic all its own, and I would say exists in a stylistic and temperamental area somewhere between the relative hope and optimism of Stephen King and the pessimism of Richard Bachman. And it's a very effective book, and in my opinion would be a great place for a newbie to the Stephen King universe to start. It's fairly straightforward. It's not overwhelmingly or dauntingly long. A lot of people are familiar with it anyway because of the movie. They're familiar with the movie even if they haven't seen it. They know what it is. So yeah, it's definitely one of my favorites. And the US edition is fairly easy to find in the US. It'd be a little hard to find one in nice shape, but they are out there. I'm working my way toward the end of the 80s, and I'm into territory where the books are desirable and they're highly collectible, but they're not particularly rare or hard to find. The UK edition, I love the style of the jackets. They make really cool companion pieces. And of course, it felt a little bit like overkill to have more than one special edition of the same book, but the Folio Society edition is really cool, and it's unique, and it's handsome, and it's available now for a decent price. And the Suntup edition is just, bar none, one of the nicest Stephen King gift editions, at least. But there are some fairly pedestrian signed and limited editions, numbered editions, and the Suntup Artist Edition of Misery is, it goes the distance with any special, signed, limited, whatever edition that has been released of Stephen King's works. And the actual numbered and lettered Suntups are just grails beyond grails. I think with the limitation on the Suntup that there were 250 copies, but not all of them were made available to the public. I think some of them were for Stephen King for his private distribution. So it makes it a very rare and desirable item indeed, worth thousands of dollars. And the lettered edition, I think is in five figures now, over $10,000 for a book that was just released 4 years ago. That's pretty remarkable. But Suntup Editions is a pretty remarkable publishing company. Anyway, this has been a very rambly and sort of disjointed stream of consciousness journey through this book and my feelings about it, but I hope that you enjoyed this. I hope it's been useful. As always, I thank you for your time and for your support as I work my rambly way and my super obsessive nerdy way through my collection. And you know, the more of these videos that I do, the more I realize that I probably really am Stephen King's #1 fan. Truly, I think, I mean, it has to be me. I've read all his books. I mean, every single one. I love his work so much.